That evening, rain streaked the hallway windows of Harrogate apartments and blurred the streetlights into pale smears. Rowan Kade stood at the door of Unit 12B with a single sheet of paper in his hand. The ink was crisp and the message blunt. Eviction notice. Past due. Vacate within days. He read it anyway, then folded it and unfolded it like that could change the deadline. His hands began to tremble. The kind of shake he could blame on stress. But never fully on stress. He had been sober for 2 days because he was broke. And the craving sat behind his ribs like a hot stone. Rowan had once been a job site electrician. The guy crews called when a panel kept tripping or a stairwell light died. These days, the only circuits he worried about were the ones that decided who counted as a resident. He shoved the notice into his pocket and headed down the stairs. Telling himself he was going to trash room 6 for scrap he could sell for a few coins. He also knew the lobby cameras liked to linger on his face. And he did not want Maris Quill, the building manager, to see him looking cornered. On the second landing, a wall speaker crackled and filled the stairwell with a voice that sounded like it had never missed a meal. The speaker said, "Residents of Harrogate Apartments, a scheduled scan will begin in the morning. Please wear your residency band and be present for verification." Rowan stopped with one hand on the rail. The Landlord Scan. People in Greyline Ward said the words the way you said weather alerts. He kept moving. The door to trash room 6 was half shut. A thin strip of light cut under it, brighter than the hallway lights should allow. Rowan pushed the door open with 2 fingers. A woman crouched behind the sorting bins, pressed tight to the wall. Her jacket was dark with dried blood near the ribs. She did not look drunk or dazed. She looked alert, as if she was counting exits. The woman lifted her eyes. The woman said, "Rowan Kade." The name hit him harder than the smell. No one in the building used his last name. No one should have known it. Rowan said, "What did you say?" The woman said, "Please, not here." Rowan's gaze dropped to her wrist. Bare skin. No residency band. His own wrist was bare too. And shame tightened his jaw. Rowan said, "You are hurt." The woman said, "I can walk." She tried to rise. Her body swayed, then caught itself. The wall speaker crackled again. Louder, closer to a warning. The speaker said, "Reminder, residents must present a valid residency band. Noncompliance may result in temporary detainment for safety review." Rowan looked toward the door. Temporary detainment was how people disappeared without anyone needing to call it arrest. He looked back at the woman. In her eyes he saw fear, but also a calm decision, like she had already accepted what she might lose. He exhaled and held out his forearm without touching her. Rowan said, "Lean on me." She hesitated, then nodded once and took his support with a grip that was firm. Not desperate, they moved into the stairwell, keeping to the inside, away from the camera lens at the corner. Rowan listened for footsteps, for any door opening, for Maris Quill's voice. Rowan said, "What is your name?" The woman said, "Sae Lirone." Rowan guided her up, one flight at a time, and tried not to think about what it meant that she knew his name. Inside Unit 12B, Rowan locked the door and pressed the cheap bolt into place. The apartment was almost empty. A broken chair, a thin blanket, and a sink that dripped in a slow, steady beat. The air smelled like old sweat and stale heat. Sae sat on the floor with her back against the wall. She kept her breathing even, but Rowan could see the effort in her shoulders. Rowan said, "I do not have a medical kit." He opened a drawer and found paper towels, antiseptic wipes, and a roll of packing tape. Rowan said, "This is all I have." Sae said, "It is enough." Rowan knelt and peeled back the edge of her jacket. The wound was a jagged line along her ribs, part burn, part cut, as if heat had grazed her and then something sharp had finished the job. Rowan's fingers shook as he cleaned it. He hated the tremor, hated how his body advertised weakness. Sae watched his hands. Sae said, "Drink water." Rowan said, "What?" Sae said, "It will help you steady." He almost snapped back, but he was too tired to fight a useful suggestion. He filled a plastic cup and drank. The water tasted of rust, but his throat unclenched. When he went back to the bandage, His hands were still unsteady, but he could manage. Sae did not flinch when the wipe stung. She did not thank him either. She simply let him finish and adjusted the tape with careful fingers. Rowan sat back on his heels. Rowan said, "Why were you in the trash room?" Sae reached into her inner pocket and produced a plain sliver of metal. Matte and unmarked. It looked like nothing, like scrap a kid would flick into a drain. She held it with a care that made Rowan's skin prickle. Sae said, "The witness shard." Rowan said, "That is just metal." Sae said, "It is designed to look harmless." She turned it so the kitchen light caught a faint seam along the edge. Sae said, "It contains a file, the Quiet Purge File." The name meant nothing to Rowan, but the way Sae said it did, like a wound you do not touch unless you are ready for the pain. Sae said, "Evidence of removals during the war. Records erased so the public would accept a clean ending." Rowan's stomach tightened. He had lived the war as ration lines and job closures, and then as years of being sorted by scores. He did not know the kind of secrets that started wars, but he knew the kind that kept people quiet. A muffled announcement seeped through the hallway wall. The speaker said, "Residents, verification will begin earlier than scheduled. Proceed to assigned checkpoints." Rowan's eyes dropped to his wrist again. Bare. His residency band had been seized months ago after he missed a verification appointment. The system had stopped calling him a resident and started calling him a risk. Sae followed his gaze. Sae said, "You do not have one." Rowan laughed once, bitter and small. Rowan said, "No, which means if they knock on my door, I am done." Sae nodded as if she had expected that. Sae said, "That is why I chose this building. And why I chose you." Rowan's throat went dry. Rowan said, "You chose me?" Sae held his eyes. Sae said, "I searched welfare and housing records for someone with wiring experience who was no longer protected by the system. Someone who could move through service spaces. Someone people did not watch closely." Rowan let the words settle. He was not picked because he was strong. He was picked because he was invisible. Rowan said, "So I am useful." Sae said, "Yes." Then, after a beat, she pushed the cup toward him again. Sae said, "And you are still here." Rowan took the cup, more for the gesture than the water. He heard a heavy click in the hallway. Then another, like locks answering a command. Fear spread through him with a cold clarity. Rowan said, "Can you stand?" Sae rose, slower now, but steady. She tucked the witness shard back inside her jacket, close to her skin. Rowan grabbed his screwdriver and slipped it into his belt. He only told himself he was done choosing the easiest surrender. The hallway lights shifted from weak yellow to a harsh white that made every stain look intentional. Rowan cracked his door and peered out. The corridor was empty, but the ceiling cameras had rotated, their lenses aimed down the hall as if they had finally decided to notice him. From far below, the scan gate chimed, thin and polite. The sound repeated at regular intervals, like a heartbeat that belonged to the building, not the people inside it. A wall speaker blared. The speaker said, "Immediate verification in progress. Remain in your units. Doors may be secured for resident safety." Rowan shut the door and pressed his ear to it. He heard boots on the stairs. Paced and even, more than one pair. He heard a trained voice calling out units. A voice said, "Start at the end. Verify bands. Log red tags." Rowan felt the building respond. A heavy click sounded outside his neighbor's door. Then another farther down the hall. Rowan opened his door a fraction and saw the indicator on the nearest lock flip from green to red. The building was going into lockdown. Sae stood behind him, breathing shallow. Sae said, "If you hand me over, they may leave you alone." Rowan turned to face her. His hands had stopped shaking. Not because he was well, but because fear had replaced craving. He thought of Maris Quill's smile when rent was late. He thought of the eviction notice in his pocket. He thought of how quickly a file could label him a helper and make him disappear. He also thought of Sae bleeding behind trash bins, saying his name like he still mattered. Rowan said, "They will not leave me alone. They will just delay it." Boots reached their floor. A fist knocked on a door across the hall. A child cried. An adult voice begged for time to find a band. Rowan glanced at the service panel in his kitchen wall. He had opened it once to fix a short in the corridor lighting circuit. Behind it was a narrow cable run that connected to the building's spine. Tight and filthy, but unmonitored. He pulled the panel loose. Dust and warm insulation smell rolled out. Rowan said, "This way." Sae looked at the gap. Then at him. Sae said, "You know the service routes." Rowan said, "I used to work here. I remember enough." Sae tucked the witness shard deeper into her jacket. Then she slid into the crawl space. Shoulders scraping, breath controlled. Rowan followed, pulling the panel back into place as best he could. In the dark, he could feel the building vibrate with rerouted power. He could hear the polite chime of the scan gate below, the clicks of locks, the low murmur of a system that never needed to raise its voice. Near dawn, as the rain eased outside, Harrogate Apartments became a sealed box. Inside it, Rowan Kade and Sae Lirone moved through the walls like ghosts. And Rowan understood with a quiet shock that the scan was not meant to find residents. It was meant to sort out who could be erased. 2 hours into the lockdown, Harrogate Apartments felt like a sealed lung. Rowan Kade crawled through the building's spine, shoulders scraping wood, palms sliding over warm insulation. Below him, the scan gate chimed at steady intervals, polite the way a warning can be polite. Sae Lirone moved ahead with careful precision. One hand stayed near her ribs, keeping pressure where the bandage needed it. She did not limp so much as ration motion. They dropped into a supply closet and eased the door shut. Through the slats, Rowan watched a hallway camera swivel, pause, then sweep again, as if searching for the shape of a mistake. A wall speaker crackled. A calm voice said, "Residents, remain in your units. Present your residency band when requested. Failure to comply may result in detainment for safety review." Rowan mouthed the last words without sound. Safety review was what people said when they wanted neighbors to accept a van and a silence. Rowan leaned close to Sae. Rowan said, "They're coming up." Sae kept her eyes on the corridor. Sae said, "This is not random. They're running a named operation." Rowan frowned. Rowan said, "How do you know?" Sae answered with a small tilt of her head toward the speaker cadence. "The timing, the staged calm." Sae said, "The pattern. They sweep, they pause, they tighten. It is a play." Footsteps approached, measured and close. A door opened across the hall and a man held out his wrist before he was asked. A reader chirped. A guard tapped a tablet and stepped on. 2 uniforms marked Vossline Protective Services moved past the closet. One carried the reader. The other carried a stun baton low, as if it was a normal tool. The hum arrived next, faint but unmistakable. Rowan felt it in his teeth. Rowan said, "Heat sweep array." Sae's jaw set. Sae said, "It can see into walls?" Rowan kept his voice down. Rowan said, "Into thin ones. It will light up service spaces too." The guards reached an older woman farther down the hall. She raised her wrist, band worn dull from years. The reader chirped, then paused. The tablet flashed from yellow to red. The guard kept his voice gentle. The guard said, "Please remain where you are." The woman swallowed. The woman said, "What does red mean?" The guard did not answer her. He spoke into his radio. The guard said, "Red tag confirmed on floor 9. Rowan turned away from the slats before his anger gave him away. Rowan said, "They can mark anyone." Sae's voice stayed low. Sae said, "If they own the ledger, they own the meaning of compliance." Rowan waited until the guards turned the corner. He cracked the closet door and pointed down the corridor to service stairwell C. The one residents avoided. It smelled like wet concrete and hot metal. And it had blind spots the cameras never quite covered. Sae nodded once. They moved with the building noise. Steps timed between distant knocks and the soft chime below. As they reached the stairwell, the speaker added a new line, almost friendly. The voice said, "Residents may be eligible for rent relief upon cooperation with verification. Contact building management for details." Rowan's throat tightened. Maris Quill had turned fear into a discount. Rowan pulled his phone from his pocket and tried the city helpline out of habit. The screen spun, then returned a message that the network was unavailable. He tried once more, then stopped. Sae noticed the motion. Sae said, "They are throttling bandwidth. Inside the perimeter, outbound traffic is limited. People cannot coordinate. People cannot warn others." Rowan stared at the dead connection. Rowan said, "They can do that in a rental building?" Sae answered without heat. Sae said, "They can if the lease grants emergency control. And most people sign because they are tired." They slipped into service stairwell C and descended in silence. Rowan counted the seconds between heat sweeps and listened for the echo of boots. On the fourth landing, he led Sae into a maintenance corridor that ran behind the units like an exposed vein. Sae kept close. Sae said, "Where?" Rowan nodded toward the only place that could hide their warmth and their panic. Rowan said, "Maintenance bay." Maintenance bay sat behind a steel door that never latched right. Rowan pried it with his screwdriver and pulled Sae inside. Fans filled the room with constant breath, masking footsteps and blurring heat into noise. Sae leaned on a workbench and closed her eyes for a moment. Rowan did not tell her to rest. Rest was a luxury they could not schedule. At the far wall, a screen glowed with a plain interface. The label read Tenant Ledger Terminal. Rowan had seen it years ago when he fixed a failed power supply. Back when it handled keys and billing. Now it looked like command. He tapped the screen. A login prompt appeared. He tried an old default code he remembered from contractor days. The terminal accepted it with a soft chime. Rows of names filled the display. Each had a color marker beside it. Green, yellow, red. Rowan searched for his own and found it too quickly. Rowan Kade, Unit 12B, red. His mouth went dry. The building had already decided he was removable. Rowan opened the detail view beside his name. A set of fields expanded. Cold, residency verification missed, utility arrears flagged, identity confidence low, removal risk acceptable. He read the last line twice. It was not a threat. It was a calculation. Sae spoke like someone naming weather. Sae said, "They do not need a court. They need an excuse that looks like policy." Rowan scrolled through the red tag list and saw patterns. The marked names were not criminals. They were late payers, the unbanded, the elderly who missed appointments, the workers who moved too often. It was a harvest of the weak. Sae stepped beside him, eyes scanning without surprise. Sae said, "They do not need proof. They need categories." Rowan clicked open a log window. One phrase repeated with time stamps. Operation Sieve. Below it, line items listed floor sweeps, band reads, heat sweeps, and lock checks. It was not a response. It was a schedule. Rowan whispered. Rowan said, "They named the trap." Sae nodded. Sae said, "A sieve keeps what they want and lets the rest fall." A voice rose in the corridor outside, close enough to carry through the door seam. Rowan recognized it. Jay Moreno. Jay said, "The panel is old. It cannot take another surge." Another voice answered, calm and hard. The guard said, "Open it anyway." Rowan moved to the small window in the door. Jay stood in the hallway with his hands half raised, palms out. Two guards flanked him. One held a baton. The other held a reader. The guard spoke like policy. The guard said, "You know the service routes. You will open access on floor 10. Jay swallowed. Jay said, "Families live up there." The guard replied. The guard said, "We are conducting a safety review." In the corridor, Jay hesitated near a utility cabinet. A guard nudged him toward it with the baton tip. Not striking, only steering. Jay opened the cabinet and revealed a relay cluster with bundled wires and a labeled box. The label read Lockdown Relay Box. Rowan felt a jolt of recognition. If Vossline gained direct access to the relay cluster, they could seal sections in seconds and force people into the open. A funnel made of doors. Jay's voice dropped. Jay said, "If I touch this wrong, someone gets trapped." The guard replied. The guard said, "Then touch it right." Rowan felt his stomach knot. They were using Jay as a key, forcing labor into compliance. turning skill into a weapon. He searched the ledger for J. Moreno. The marker beside J's name was yellow. Rowan said, "They have him on leverage." Sae answered. Sae said, "Yellow means pressure. Red means disposal." Rowan looked back at the repeating log entries. If floor 10 access opened, the team could cut off the last high routes. They were not hunting in circles. They were building a funnel. Sae touched her jacket where the witness shard lay hidden. Sae said, "We need people around us. People slow them." Rowan shut down the terminal and wiped the screen with a rag. Rowan said, "I know someone who might help. Dina Holt, 9th floor." Sae studied him. Sae said, "Do you trust her?" Rowan exhaled. Rowan said, "I trust that she hates Maris Quill more than she hates me." The heat sweep hum rose again, faint through the walls. Rowan did not wait for it to pass. He opened the back duct corridor and led Sae into the building vanes. Dina Holt opened her door only a hand's width, chain still on. Her eyes took in Rowan's face. Then Sae's posture. Then the blood stain. Dina said, "Rowan, you look like you brought a storm." Rowan kept his voice quiet. Rowan said, "We need a place for a few minutes." Dina's gaze flicked to Rowan's bare wrist. Dina said, "They took your band." Rowan answered. Rowan said, "Months ago." Dina's mouth tightened. She looked past them into the hallway, listening to distant knocks. Then she unhooked the chain and opened the door. Dina said, "Get in, quickly." Rowan guided Sae inside. Dina slid the chain back and dragged a chair against the knob. It was not real security. It was a ritual that kept her hands from shaking. The apartment smelled of thin porridge and menthol balm. A blanket lay folded on the sofa, and a pot warmed on the stove with barely any steam. Dina ladled a small bowl of porridge and set it on the table. The smell was thin but warm. Rowan realized he had not eaten since the day before. Dina said, "Eat. Your body cannot argue with fear on an empty tank." Rowan took a few bites. The food steadied him more than pride ever had. Sae watched the exchange, then spoke to Dina with careful respect. Sae said, "I did not come here to endanger you. I came here because they will erase people and call it order." Dina held Sae's gaze. Dina said, "Order is always paid for by someone who cannot afford it." Sae sat and kept her breathing controlled. Dina tossed a roll of gauze and a small tube of antiseptic toward Rowan. Dina said, "If you dragged her here, you patch her. I am not dying for anyone." Rowan knelt and checked the bandage. He did it with less fumbling than before, but his hands still trembled. He hated the tremor because it felt like a confession. Dina watched him and snorted. Dina said, "Water. Sit when you are done." Rowan worked fast and gentle. Sae did not flinch. She watched Rowan's hands like she was tracking a system under strain, not judging a man. When he finished, Rowan drank water at the sink. The craving pressed in, whispering promises. He held the cup with both hands until the wave eased. Sae spoke softly. Sae said, "It comes in pulses. Do not chase it. Let it pass." Rowan looked at her. Rowan said, "You speak like you have seen this?" Sae answered. Sae said, "I have seen what people cling to when they are cornered. Different substance, same math." In the hallway, a wall speaker inside Dina's unit crackled. The voice was not the city voice. It was Maris Quill, smooth and practiced. Maris Quill said, "Attention, tenants. Building management is offering rent relief for cooperative verification. If you have information about unauthorized occupants, report it immediately. Protect your home. Protect your neighbors." Rowan felt something cold spread through his chest. Quill had made betrayal sound like civic duty. Dina muttered under her breath. Dina said, "That man would sell his own shadow." A knock sounded 2 doors down. Then another. Boots moved with patient timing. Somewhere, a band reader chirped. Sae sat up straighter. Sae said, "If the crowd turns, we cannot hide behind walls." Rowan stared at the chair braced against the door. He thought of the older woman marked red in the hallway. He thought of his own red marker in the ledger. He thought of the witness shard. Small enough to fit in a palm. Heavy enough to change lives. Rowan spoke in a low, steady voice. Rowan said, "We do not just hide. We find the machine and we make it slip." Dina lifted her chin. Dina said, "You break anything in my building. You break it smart. I do not want smoke." Rowan nodded. The fear was still there, but it had a new edge. It was no longer only fear of being taken. It was fear of living as someone who always surrendered. Rowan turned to Sae. Rowan said, "We move together. No more leaving one person to take the hit." Sae met his eyes. Sae said, "Agreed." Outside, the heat sweep hum rose again. Closer this time. Rowan listened to its rhythm and began planning. Not how to vanish, but how to put a hand on the lever that named people red. An hour after Maris Quill's offer had echoed through the building speakers, Rowan Kade stood in Dina Holt's kitchen and listened to the hum of the next heat sweep. The sound was faint, but it had rhythm, like the building was breathing for someone else. Sae Lirone watched the window by the sink, tracking the hallway light that kept brightening and dimming as locks cycled. Dina kept her voice low. Dina said, "You picked a bad night to grow a conscience." Rowan nodded once. He had already decided, and that was the dangerous part. The witness shard in Sae's jacket was useless without the shard power coupler, and Sae had stashed the coupler in the one place nobody searched unless they wanted to feel filthy. Rowan said, "Trash room 6. We go now, between sweeps." Sae tightened her grip on the table edge. Sae said, "If they saw your red marker, they will expect you to panic. They will be watching for that." Rowan did not argue. He took Dina's spare flashlight and wrapped a cloth around the lens so it would not throw a clean beam. Dina slid her old maintenance keyring into his palm, metal warm from her pocket. Dina said, "Do not make me regret this." Rowan said, "I will bring it back." Sae met Dina's eyes. Sae said, "Thank you." Dina scoffed as if gratitude was a currency that could get you killed. Dina said, "Go." They slipped into the corridor as the heat sweep passed 2 floors below. A soft electric pressure that made the air feel tight. Rowan kept Sae close to the wall, using door frames to break their outline from the camera angles he remembered. The hallways smelled of damp carpet and fear, and every unit door seemed to hold its breath. The building speaker clicked on again, a different voice than before, crisp and trained. The voice said, "Verification teams are active. Please remain calm and keep your wrist visible when asked." A unit door opened ahead. A man held his arm out before anyone spoke to him, then recoiled when the reader chirped twice. 2 guards guided him into the stairwell. Not rough, not kind, just efficient. Sae whispered. Sae said, "This is not a check. It is a funnel." Rowan led her toward a service access panel and waited as the hallway camera rotated away. The moment it turned, they crossed, fast and quiet, and ducked into the maintenance corridor that ran behind the trash chute. Trash room 6 was 1 turn away. Rowan tasted metal in his mouth and did not know if it was fear or the building air. When he pushed the door, the stink hit him first, then the heat, then the sudden white glare of a ceiling light that should have been off. Sae froze. Rowan heard it too, a thin electronic chirp from above the doorframe. Rowan said, "They added a proximity sensor." He stepped back and looked up. A small lens stared down like an insect eye. Someone had updated the room after their first visit. Someone had done it for them. Sae exhaled through her nose. Sae said, "Then we do it quickly." Rowan pulled the maintenance ring and tried the lock. It turned. The door opened, and the smell of chemical cleaner mixed with rot rolled out. The bins were stacked in new positions, angled to force a straight path down the center. Rowan said, "They changed the layout." Sae said, "To keep bodies in view." They moved in, keeping to the narrow shadow between bins. Rowan found the corner where Sae had hidden the coupler, behind a cracked plastic panel near the compactor. His hands trembled as he reached into the grime. The shard power coupler was smaller than his thumb, a dull cartridge with 2 contact points. Rowan wiped it on his sleeve until it looked less like trash. Sae took it without hesitation and slipped it into her jacket pocket beside the witness shard. Her face did not soften, but her shoulders eased a fraction. Rowan said, "We have it, now we go." They made it to the door. Rowan eased it open and checked the hall. Empty. The camera at the corner was facing away. He stepped out, then Sae. And for a breath it felt like they had stolen a clean win. The alarm waited for that breath. A siren erupted above them, sharp and immediate, and the corridor lights snapped to a hard red. A recorded message layered over the noise, calm and merciless. The system said, "Unauthorized access detected. Remain where you are." Sae's eyes widened, not in surprise, but in anger. Rowan understood the timing. The sensor had not triggered when they entered. It triggered when they left. Rowan said, "Someone watched and held it." Boots hammered the stairwell door at the far end of the hall. Rowan grabbed Sae's wrist and pulled her toward the maintenance corridor. But the fire door between them and the corner slammed shut with a heavy click. They were boxed in, exactly where the bins had guided them, exactly where the camera could see. Two Vossline Protective Services guards appeared from the stairwell, visors down, batons low. Behind them, Maris Quill walked as if he owned the hallway. Because in every practical sense he did. Quill held a tablet against his chest. He did not look at Sae first. He looked at Rowan. Maris Quill said, "You are making this difficult." Rowan. Rowan felt his pulse in his throat. Rowan said, "You put a sensor on the trash room." Quill shrugged. Maris Quill said, "I improved security. The building pays me to reduce risk." Sae lifted her chin. Sae said, "You are selling a person." Quill's mouth tightened as if she had used a word that belonged to courts. "Not apartments." Maris Quill said, "I am protecting tenants. You are an unauthorized occupant." Rowan heard a unit door open behind them. Then another. Residents were being pushed out, herded into the hall. The guards lined them against the wall, wrists visible, eyes down. A mother clutched a little boy close and whispered without sound. Rowan said, "You promised rent relief. That is your pitch." Quill glanced toward the residents. Maris Quill said, "They need hope. I provide it. Cooperation is rewarded." Rowan saw it then. The real weapon. Not the batons. Not the locks. The idea that survival could be purchased by turning your head. A guard seized Rowan's arm and twisted it behind his back. Rowan did not scream, but he gasped as pain shot through his shoulder. Another guard reached for Sae, and Sae moved with a sudden precision, slipping her elbow free, stepping in a way that kept the witness shard protected. The baton touched her ribs, and she flinched for the first time. Quill's voice stayed even. Maris Quill said, "Do not escalate. You will make this worse for yourself." Rowan spat the words out. Rowan said, "For myself. That is always the point." Quill leaned closer, low enough that the guards did not have to hear. Maris Quill said, "I am keeping my contract. Without it, this building loses services. Power fails. Heat fails. People die slowly. You want to be the reason?" Rowan stared at him. Quill believed his own math. That was what made him useful to Calder Voss. The guards marched them down the hall, past faces that would not meet Rowan's eyes. Dina Holt stood in her doorway with her chain still on, jaw clenched hard enough to shake. She did not move, because movement would make her a target. Rowan held her gaze anyway. He gave a small nod, a promise without words. They took Rowan and Sae to the management suite near the lobby, where the air was cleaner and the carpet thicker. Cameras watched from every corner. A small sign on the wall displayed a slogan about community safety. Sae whispered to Rowan as they waited, hands bound with polymer cuffs. Sae said, "Quill wants money. Voss wants precedent." Rowan asked, "What does that mean?" Sae said, "If this works here, it works everywhere." The door opened. Calder Voss walked in like a man arriving to settle a dispute, not to claim a life. His suit was plain, his shoes spotless. He carried no baton, only a folder and a pen. Calder Voss said, "Mr. Kade, Miss Lirone." Rowan stared. Rowan said, "You know her name too?" Voss smiled as if the comment was naive. Calder Voss said, "Names are data. Data is governance." He set the folder on the table and slid it toward Rowan. Inside were pages of dense clauses, signature lines, and a single summary sheet printed in large type. Calder Voss said, You are in arrears. Your residency status is unstable. Your employment history is incomplete. You are one emergency away from being classified as transient. Rowan said, I am already there. Voss did not deny it. Calder Voss said, not officially. That is the difference between a problem and a policy. He tapped the summary sheet with his pen. Calder Voss said, I can clear your balance. I can restore your residency band within 1 day. I can place you on a maintenance contract with Vossline. Benefits included. Your record becomes green. Rowan felt his stomach twist. The offer was not kindness. It was a leash made of paperwork. Rowan asked, and the price? Voss turned his gaze to Sae. Calder Voss said, the witness shard. Sae held still. Sae said, you are afraid of a file. Voss said, I am afraid of disorder. Sae said, the Quiet Purge File is not disorder. It is proof. Voss opened his folder and drew out a single page. A list of incident codes and dates. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Voss said, during the war, we removed threats before they became crises. We did it quietly to prevent panic. The record was consolidated, then sealed. What you carry would reopen old wounds and invite retaliation. Rowan heard the word removed and understood it without any lecture. People had vanished, not because they were guilty, but because they fit a profile someone wanted gone. Sae said, you erased civilians. You erased the evidence. You call it stability. Voss inclined his head. Voss said, I call it triage. Rowan looked down at the contract. At the promise of a bed and heat and a wristband that made you count. He imagined walking out of this office with his name turned green again. With a job that paid. With the ability to stop shaking for reasons other than fear. Then he imagined Sae walking out without the shard. Watched and escorted to a door that did not open back. Rowan lifted his eyes to Voss. Rowan said, you make it sound easy. Voss's tone stayed patient. Voss said, it is easy. You do not have to be noble. You only have to be practical. Sae's voice was quiet. Sae said, Rowan, do not do it for me. Do it for the people they will tag next. Rowan swallowed. His mouth tasted like rust. Like the building air that never fully left your lungs. He realized this was the point of the whole operation. Not to catch an alien woman. To test whether a man like him could be bought. Rowan said, if I sign, you clear my debt. Voss said, immediately. Rowan said, you give me a band. Voss said, within 1 day. Rowan said, you give me work. Voss said, yes. Rowan nodded as if he had accepted. Rowan said, then I need one thing first. Voss lifted his pen. Voss said, state it. Rowan leaned forward, eyes on the camera above the desk. Rowan said, uncuff my right hand, I cannot sign like this. Voss glanced at the guard near the door. The guard stepped in, efficient, and released one cuff, leaving Rowan's left wrist still bound to the chair ring. Rowan flexed his right hand, feeling blood rush back into his fingers. Voss slid the pen closer. Rowan took it, held it over the signature line, and lowered his head as if reading. His heart pounded, but his mind stayed sharp in a way it had not been in months. He did not write his name. He jabbed the pen into the seam of the desk panel where a maintenance latch sat flush with the wood. The latch popped. Rowan yanked the panel open and exposed a relay port. The kind that fed the lock circuits and camera power. Rowan said, I used to fix your building. He ripped the relay plug free. The lights blinked once. The camera feed above the desk stuttered. The door lock clicked, then released for a fraction of a second as the system defaulted to safety mode. Sae moved at the same instant, driving her shoulder into the guard and slipping past him. Rowan shoved the chair back, still half bound, and slammed the door with his shoulder to keep it from catching on the relocking bolt. Voss did not shout. He watched with a cold focus, already recalculating. Voss said, you are choosing to lose everything. Rowan yanked his left wrist free as the chair ring bent. Rowan said, I already lost it. You are just offering to rent it back. Sae grabbed Rowan's arm and pulled him into the corridor. Alarms began to rise again. Delayed, angry. Behind them, Calder Voss reached for his phone. Not to chase, but to tighten the building like a fist. Rowan ran anyway, because for the first time in a long time, he was not running to hide. He was running to give Sae a window, however small, to keep the witness shard out of Voss's hands. Rowan Kade reached the service stairwell with his lungs burning and his hands steady for the wrong reason. The alarm behind him did not scream. It persisted, measured, like a system billing him for every step. Sae Lirone stayed close, one palm pressed to her ribs, moving as if pain was another ration. They climbed, not down, because the sweep teams were tightening from the lobby upward. A heat sweep hummed through the concrete, and Rowan felt it in his teeth. The heat sweep array was mapping the building like a body, searching for warmth that did not belong. A wall speaker clicked on, calm enough to be cruel. The voice said, "Verification continues by floor sequence. Tenants are advised to remain visible in hallways when requested." Rowan heard the message underneath the words. "If you hide, you become a problem they can label." He led Sae through a corridor where the hallway camera could not quite see the corner. He waited for the lens to drift, then pulled her across and into a warped door that still stuck on its frame. The maintenance bay swallowed them in fan noise and stale oil. Backup power kept the room alive, but barely. The strip light flickered, and the fans surged and sagged as if the building was deciding what it could afford. A man rose from behind a workbench with a flashlight raised. "Jay Moreno." Jay said, "Rowan? They said you were in custody." Rowan said, "They said a lot of things." Jay's eyes flicked to Sae, then back to Rowan. His wrist was banded, but the plastic looked freshly scanned, as if it had been read too many times in one night. Jay said, "They tagged me yellow. They told me to earn my way back to green." Sae said, "By helping them cage this building?" Jay swallowed. Jay said, "By opening doors, by naming routes, by being useful." Rowan glanced at the breaker panel and the relay pack that fed the upper stairwell locks. He could see the net, and he could see the only way to make it slip without pretending he could tear it apart. Rowan said, "We need a window, not a miracle, a window." Jay frowned. Jay said, "They will notice any outage. Vossline has techs on standby. They adapt fast." Rowan said, "Then we do it small and clean. A controlled brownout in one branch. A few heartbeats." Jay looked at the panel, then at Rowan. Jay said, "Why would that open anything?" Rowan said, "Some fire doors still run legacy lock drivers. If the driver loses clean power, it drops to safety mode. The latch releases for a breath before the battery catches." Sae asked, "How long is a breath?" Rowan said, "A few seconds, enough to pass a door, not enough to hesitate." Jay rubbed his face with his free hand. Jay said, "They changed patrol routes already. They stopped checking units. They're driving people toward the stairwells." Sae touched her jacket pocket. Sae said, "Higher gets cleaner line of sight. The building has an emergency antenna. Old, but wired." Rowan held Jay's gaze. Rowan said, "If this operation works, Harrogate becomes a template, your job becomes a trap. Your neighbors become bait." Jay's hand lowered the flashlight. The choice cost him something you could see in his face. Jay said, "Tell me what to pull." Rowan opened the panel with a maintenance key and pointed to a labeled branch feed. Rowan said, "On my count, you drop it for one count. Then restore. No hesitation. Hesitation cooks the driver and closes the door forever." The heat sweep hum rose again. Closer now, and the fans dipped with it, as if the building was pulling power for the hunt. Rowan said, "We move between sweeps." The stairwell above ran on emergency strips that made faces look older. Wind pushed through hairline cracks, carrying the smell of rain and tar. Rowan climbed first, then Sae, then Jay, timing their steps to the distant chirps of band readers and the muffled knocks below. At a landing, Sae leaned her shoulder against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. Rowan slid his jacket off and draped it over her shoulders without asking. The gesture was small, but it changed the air between them. Sae opened her eyes and did not hand it back. Rowan offered her a small water bottle. She shook her head. Sae said, "You need it." Rowan drank, then spoke before he lost his nerve. Rowan said, "Back in the trash room. You said my name like you already knew me. How?" Sae met his gaze. There was no drama in her expression, only fatigue and resolve. Sae said, "Housing assistance files, utility arrears, work permits, old maintenance payroll. I searched for someone who could move through service spaces and who would not be protected by a band." Rowan stared at his bare wrist. Shame rose fast, hot, and familiar. Rowan said, "So I was a filter?" Sae said, "You were a person inside the filter." Rowan let out a short breath. Rowan said, "That is not how it felt. It felt like I was already gone." Sae watched him, then spoke with careful honesty. Sae said, "It is how it felt to me too. I learned the system by being inside it. I learned that people who fall out of it are easy to erase. Because no one can prove they were ever here." Rowan's hands trembled again, the craving pressing in like a wave. Sae reached out and placed 2 fingers on his wrist, light as a test of pulse. Sae said, "Breathe, slow, you do not feed the wave by fighting it." Rowan did, because he had no better tool. Inhale, hold, release. The tremor eased enough to let him move. Rowan said, "If we get your file out, Voss will call it chaos." Sae nodded. Sae said, "He will call it anything that keeps him clean." Jay shifted behind them, voice rough. Jay said, "And Maris Quill will sell the story to the tenants. Rent relief for obedience." Rowan looked up the stairwell. Rowan said, "Then we give them a different story. One with proof, and one with a price Voss cannot pay quietly." The heat sweep hum rose again. Rowan said, "10th floor, do it clean." On the 10th floor, the fire door to the roof access sat at the end of a short corridor. A camera above it swept slow, patient arcs. The lock indicator glowed red. Rowan crouched by the wiring chase panel. Jay knelt beside him, fingers poised on the branch feed. Sae stood back, eyes on the stairwell door, listening to the rise of boots. The building speaker clicked again, and this time the message sounded like an order wrapped in policy. The voice said, "Red tag extractions are prioritized. Tenants are advised to avoid interference." Rowan felt the sentence land like a weight. Interference was another word for being human. Boots rose fast from below. The sweep teams had stopped pretending this was routine. A calm voice carried up the concrete. A guard said, "Hold the 10th, do not let them reach the roof." Rowan raised his hand, then dropped it. Rowan said, "Now." Jay pulled. The emergency strips flickered. The camera froze mid-sweep. The lock indicator blinked from red to amber. Rowan lunged, grabbed the handle, and pulled. The latch released with a heavy click. Cold air rushed down from above. Rowan said, "Go." Sae moved first. Jay followed. Rowan shoved himself through as the power returned and the door tried to relatch behind him. They were in the roof access stairwell when a familiar voice drifted up from the landing below. Thin and angry. "Dina Holt." Dina said, "Rowan, you idiot, are you there?" Rowan's stomach dropped. He could hear guards with her. Close. Controlled. A band reader chirped once. Then paused, as if waiting for a decision. Sae turned, eyes sharp. Sae said, "They pulled her out." Jay's face drained. Jay said, "Soft hostage. They use one person to drag the target back." Rowan gripped the rail. If he stayed, Dina would pay. If he went, the roof window might close. The antenna needed time, and time was the rarest supply in Harrogate. Sae stepped close. Sae said, "If you go, you may not return." Rowan swallowed. Rowan said, "If I do not go, she may not return to her door." He made the choice without ceremony. Rowan said, "You two go up, roof deck 9, find the antenna junction, you do not wait." Sae's gaze held him, then she nodded once. Sae said, "I will not waste it." Rowan looked to Jay. Rowan said, "Take her, you know the roof." Jay nodded, breath shaking. Jay said, "I will." Rowan went down alone. At the landing, Dina stood with her hands raised. 2 guards flanked her. Maris Quill leaned against the wall with a tablet. calm as rent collection. Quill said, "There he is, our reluctant tenant." Rowan kept his hands visible. Rowan said, "Let her go, she did nothing." Quill smiled without warmth. Quill said, "She gave you cover. Cover has a price. Voss can flip her status with one note. Read, then removed. All legitimate." Dina snapped, voice cracking with fury. Dina said, "Do not listen to him. Rowan." Rowan glanced at the smoke sensor above the hull and the small maintenance hatch beside it. He had one move that did not require a punch, only the kind of knowledge nobody respected until it saved them. He stepped under the sensor, lifted his screwdriver, and popped the hatch cover. He tugged a thin feed wire loose. The corridor lights blinked, the sensor chirped an error. The building speaker switched channels. A recorded voice said, "Fire safety fault detected. Door states may change." The nearest guard looked up, reflexive. Rowan used the glance. Rowan said, "Dina, now." Dina ducked and moved, fast and stubborn, straight to her unit. Rowan shifted into the guard's path. Not striking, just blocking, buying 1 second and paying for it with a baton shove that bruised his shoulder. Dina slammed her door. The chain clinked. The chair scraped. She was inside. Quill's smile vanished. Quill said, "Take him." Rowan ran. He hit the stairs and climbed hard, legs burning, hearing the building recover behind him. Locks clicked, cameras whirred, the net tightened as if offended. When he burst onto roof deck 9, wind tore at his shirt and rain misted his face. The city beyond was a low grid of lights under heavy clouds. An antenna mast rose near the center, cables wrapped in old tape. Sae and Jay were at the junction box, hands working fast. Sae held the witness shard close, shielding it from the wind as Jay tried to seat the shard power coupler into the port. Rowan reached them and exhaled a single word. Rowan said, "Go." Before anyone could answer, the outer roof door clanged. Red indicators lit along the perimeter fence. Boots stepped onto the tar roof with patient timing, then stopped, as if the team had been told to let fear do the talking. Calder Voss did not need to announce himself. The roof had become another office, and the paperwork was already closing around them in the wind. On roof deck 9, wind drove rain sideways and turned the tar surface slick. Red warning lights strobed along the fence and painted the officers in pulses. Vossline Protective Services held a clean semicircle, spaced like a drill, faces hidden behind visors. They did not look angry. They looked authorized. Sae Lirone and Jay Moreno crouched at the junction box under the antenna mast. Jay worked the latches with shaking hands. Sae kept the witness shard under her jacket, thumb on the shard power coupler as if it might slip away. Rowan Kade stepped forward, palms open, and kept his body between the mast and the line of officers. His forearm throbbed where a baton had found bone. He forced his breathing to stay quiet. Calder Voss approached without a visor, carrying only a folder and a pen. He stopped at a distance that felt polite, which made it worse. Voss said, "You are still choosing the expensive path." Rowan said, "You are still selling cages as discounts." Voss said, "Step away. This ends with paperwork, not injury." Rowan said, "You already hurt people. You just stamp it approved." Voss nodded once, as if granting a minor correction. Voss said, "Procedure prevents panic. Panic kills faster than any weapon." The building below sighed with muffled knocks and distant reader chirps. Even up here, Rowan could hear a city being trained to comply. Voss opened the folder and slid a page toward Rowan, Rain spotting the paper. Voss said, "Final correction. Hand over the witness shard. Your arrears are cleared. Your residency band is reinstated. Your record turns green. Mrs. Holt receives a rent credit and a medical exemption, so she will not be flagged again." Rowan felt the offer aimed at his guilt with surgical precision. Rowan said, "You think you can buy my silence with her safety?" Voss said, "I can buy stability with incentives. That is governance." Sae said, "You will call him a terrorist if he refuses." Voss did not deny it. Voss said, "I will call it urban security. People understand that language. A man without a band on a roof becomes a threat the public accepts." Rowan said, and the truth becomes noise. Voss said, the public will not read a file. They will read a headline. Rowan's throat went dry. He could see the frame Voss was building. Neat and airtight. Rowan said, you removed people during the war. Voss's voice stayed calm. Voss said, we removed risk so retaliation would not keep the war alive. The Quiet Purge File is not justice. It is gasoline. Rowan heard gasoline and thought of his own bottle. The way it promised relief while burning everything quietly. He saw the same logic in Voss. Harm dressed as medicine. Sae said, you cannot keep calling it medicine while you keep killing the patient. Voss took one step closer. Voss said, Miss Lirone, you have no standing in Tarnwell City. Rowan Kade does. He can have it back. Rowan's hands trembled, then steadied as he pressed his palms to his thighs. Rowan said, so my tag is a leash. Voss said, your tag is feedback. Behind Rowan, Sae slid the coupler into the shard port. A small indicator blinked once and held steady. Jay looked up, eyes wide. Jay whispered, it is live. Rowan kept Voss talking because talking was time. Rowan said, why turn a rental building into a net? Voss answered without shame. Voss said, because it works. Because people fear red tags more than they fear losing someone else's rights. An officer shifted and muttered, sir. Voss raised one hand. The line froze. Voss said, Rowan Kade, you are tired. You are in pain. You have a substance problem. Which makes you predictable. Sign. Sleep warm tonight. Rowan inhaled and made his choice visible. Rowan said, no. For a moment, Voss's calm hardened. Voss said, then you will be the story. Rowan nodded once. Rowan said, fine, make me the story. She will still send the truth. Sae connected the witness shard to the junction box with a short cable J pulled from the mast housing. The antenna was old, meant for weather alerts and building notices. It was ordinary enough that the network would treat it as dull traffic at first. Sae said, we cannot push it in one block. They will lock it when they see the pattern. Jay said, I can route through the building mesh. It is slow. Sae said, slow is survival. Rowan watched the officers, the way they waited for Voss like a machine waits for a command. He could not give Sae minutes. He could give her seconds. Sae spoke fast and low. Sae said, I will split the file. Small fragments. Different paths. Rowan asked, what paths? Jay nodded toward the skyline. Jay said, tenant routers, smart meters, maintenance beacons, anything that uses civilian channels. Voss called out, voice firm. Voss said, turn around, hands behind your head. Rowan did not obey. He stepped sideways, away from the mast, toward the roof edge where the wind was loudest. He wanted heat sweeps and cameras to chase him, not Sae. Sae said, first fragment going out. A faint chirp sounded from the junction box. Jay exhaled through clenched teeth. Jay said, they are seeing spikes. They will throttle. Sae pulled a cheap civilian transmitter from her pocket, the kind delivery riders used to request entry. Sae said, then we spread the fingerprints. Checksums on open channels. If they block one, another holds it. Jay rerouted. The junction box chirped again and again. Small sounds fighting a big system. Voss lifted his phone and spoke quietly. Rowan could not hear the words, but he saw the effect. The roof access door clicked into a heavier lock. The perimeter indicators shifted to full seal. The building was being tightened from the top down. Voss said, you are done. There is nowhere left. Rowan met his gaze. Rowan said, there is always somewhere left. It just is not comfortable. Two officers seized Rowan and pinned his arms. Their grip was controlled, designed to avoid complications. Rowan fought only enough to keep his body between them and the mast. Sae said, final fragment. The coupler light blinked fast, then steadied. Jay's screen flashed confirmation. Jay said, it is out, not everywhere, but out. Voss stepped closer, voice almost gentle again. Voss said, you have accomplished nothing. The city will forget by morning. Sae looked up, rain on her lashes. Sae said, You cannot unring every bell. Rowan turned his head toward Sae and forced one clear word through pain. Rowan said, "Go." Sae's eyes held Rowan for one beat longer than the wind allowed. She bent and snatched the only thing he had used to fight with. His battered screwdriver, the handle worn smooth from years of small fixes. She shoved it into her jacket pocket beside the shard, not as a trophy, but as weight that reminded her what this cost. Sae grabbed the shard and coupler. She and Jay ran to the far maintenance ladder and slipped over the edge to the lower catwalk, vanishing into rain and shadow. Voss barked, "Stop them." Rowan twisted and took the shove meant for Sae. He went down to one knee and stayed there long enough to be a problem that needed hands. That was his last purchase, paid in bruises. They dragged Rowan down the roof stairwell, water dripping from his hair onto concrete that smelled of disinfectant. The alarms were quieter now, as if the building had accepted a calmer version of itself. Rowan's wrists ached in the cuffs. On a landing, tenants were lined against the wall again. Faces stared, then looked away. No one cheered, no one threw anything. They watched a man become an example. Dina Holt stood among them, chin lifted, eyes bright with fear and anger. She was out here because witnesses turned force into consensus. Maris Quill hovered near the stairwell door with his tablet, trying to look like a manager in control. Quill said, "You brought danger into our home." Rowan's voice came out rough. Rowan said, "You sold danger a key." Voss appeared on the landing, dry now, as if rain did not apply to him. He spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. Voss said, "This man interfered with a lawful security operation. He attempted unauthorized broadcast. He endangered residents." Rowan felt the story forming around him, neat and ready. Someone whispered, "Red tag." Someone else whispered, "No band." Rowan said, "A missed scan can do it to you too." A guard shoved his shoulder. The guard said, "No talking." Dina's voice cut through the murmurs. Dina said, "Did it go out?" Rowan held her gaze and did not promise miracles. Rowan said, "Enough went out." For a second, the line shifted, not into rebellion, into discomfort. Discomfort was the first crack. Quill snapped at Dina. Quill said, "Mrs. Holt, please." Dina ignored him. She kept watching Rowan as if watching could protect him. A guard radio hissed nearby, overlapping voices, clipped and urgent. The guard said, "External oversight pinged the channel. Someone flagged leaked fragments." Rowan saw Voss register it. Not panic, calculation. Voss said, "Contain the narrative. Quill, you are relieved pending review. Your access to tenant data is suspended." Quill went pale. Quill said, "Sir, I followed procedure." Voss answered without looking at him. Voss said, "Procedure does not protect you when it becomes inconvenient." They reached the lobby. The scan gate chimed once as Rowan passed. Like a polite farewell. Outside, a transport van waited with its back doors open. Rain washed the curb clean while the city kept moving. Rowan was pushed inside. The door slammed. A dim light flickered on, and a ceiling camera blinked. Even here, there was always a watcher. Rowan closed his eyes and breathed slow, counting heartbeats, picturing Sae on wet metal, gripping the shard like a promise that cut her hands. Somewhere in Tarnwell City, fragments of the Quiet Purge File were now inside devices that did not belong to Voss. They would be copied, doubted, argued over, and maybe investigated. The system would not fall tonight, but it would have to respond. And response meant delay, and delay meant other people might get one more day. The van started to move. Rowan whispered into the dark, not for the camera, but for himself. Rowan said, "Be worth it." Far from the van, Sae and Jay clung to the lower catwalk and climbed down into a service alley where the wind could not reach them. Jay's hands were raw from wet metal. He did not ask if Rowan would be fine. He already knew better. Sae found a public kiosk under a cracked awning and watched the network logs stutter as the fragments hopped between ordinary devices. Some packets vanished, others resurfaced with new timestamps and new owners. A local watchdog channel reposted a checksum. Then another. It was not victory, it was persistence. Jay said, "They will hunt you now." Sae touched the screwdriver in her pocket and nodded. Sae said, "They already were." Before dawn, she left Tarnwell City on a crowded commuter coach. Hood up, shard wrapped in cloth, eyes fixed on the dark window. She did not carry a ring or a promise spoken aloud. She carried a tool that smelled faintly of oil and rain, and the memory of a man who chose to be human when it cost him everything. Rowan never became a hero on a poster. In Tarnwell City, the system did not collapse overnight, and Calder Voss did not vanish in handcuffs. But the Quiet Purge File stopped being a whisper that could be buried in one office. It became a bruise the city could not pretend it never had. Somewhere beyond the grid of cameras and gates, Sae Lirone kept moving with one small tool in her pocket and one hard truth in her hands. And for the first time in a long time, the machine had to hesitate. If you want to hear what happens next, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next chapter.